Hello and welcome to Polysophical. My name is Jake Taylor, and today I'm excited to read through a bit of an essay series that I wrote about this concept of the as if it were, a form of metaphor explained by Ian McGilchrist, and a few case studies of what exactly it is that I mean by an as if it were metaphor. The first few paragraphs of this essay are essentially a repetition of the first video that I made, so I'm going to go ahead and skip them, but I'm just going to dive right in and start reading, and then I'll go off on some tangents as the reading progresses so that I can explain some things, which is fun for me because my ideas have evolved a little bit since I wrote this. It was maybe a year and a half ago at this point. So, diving into the essay here, let's take a few case studies on for size in order to induce the kind of metaphorical relationship I'm talking about when I say as if it were. One example of an as if it were is free will, or more precisely, personal or moral agency. Now, briefly as a tangent, I don't think that free will in a literal sense of that phrase exists, and I don't think that it's even defensible to say that free will in terms of anybody having ultimate freedom of the will to choose whatever they want. That clearly does not exist, because not only are we born into bodies that are bounded by physical limitations, but we also are born into bodies with genetic propensities. We are born into bodies with predispositions that set us not on a fated path, but definitely on a path that is more or less bounded by our own desires, and those desires which come from our values, and those values which are dictated more or less by our biology. However, that doesn't mean that there is no such thing as agency or choice. I do not take myself as a determinist. Sorry to all the Calvinists out there. But I do have qualms with this term free will. I think that moral agency is a better one. But free will is the more common phrase to use here, so that's what I'm going to use. So back to the essay. I think that free will must be essentially treated as if it were real, or else life doesn't work properly in a phenomenological sense. It's almost as if it doesn't matter whether or not free will is literally a real thing, since if it is treated as if it were not real, bad things happen on an individual level and a societal level. What are some of those bad things? Well, I think fatalism is one of those bad things. Everything's just going to play itself out. There's nothing we can do. Nihilism is another one of those things where all of a sudden, if there is no such thing as choice, meaning tends to evaporate. So those are just a couple quick examples of what I mean by bad things may happen. And conversely, if agency is treated as if it were real, good things happen, or at the very least, phenomenologically sound things happen in a pragmatist sense of what it means to be good. And that's a very convoluted way of saying the things in the human experience which we would deem to be good. The capital V values, love and bravery and honesty, courage, hope, faith, all of these things, at one level or another, arise from a sense of being able to choose these things. A feeling of love can certainly spontaneously come up from within the soul, but to tend that love, or even more difficult, is to choose love when there is much resistance to it. These are things that rely on the ability of the human soul to make agentic decisions, and the phenomenology or the experience of those decisions, that must be spoken of as if it were real. Because maybe in a utilitarian sense, or an ultimate sense, a scientific sense, maybe free will does not exist, but it must be treated as if it exists in order for life to work as a human being. And that is really what I mean by an as if it were metaphor, because it may be so or it may not be so. We cannot really know in a concrete sense whether or not decisions that we make as human beings are true decisions in the sense that there is alternatives that may have happened. we can't know what may have happened other than at a theoretical level, because what happened, and what happens is what's happening. But to say then that there is no such thing as choice simply because what happened, that will degrade the human spirit. At least I believe so, and I don't think that it's unfounded. But we will speak more of this as if it were a free will in part 3 of this series. So to move on with the essay now. Another example of an as if it were is that of God. Regardless of whether or not there is an actual corporeal God, as the Christians believe, which, mind you, I am one, the image of God functions as if it were real, in the sense that when a society has no God, or at the very least gods in a plural sense, it has no broadly coherent sense of the sacred. It hasn't given images to the archetypes that regularly appear in human consciousness to describe the capital V values and the goings-on of the natural world and the human psyche. This coherence of what is considered sacred is immensely important because it forms a sort of bridge of values between different strata of psychological development, and that can be within a society or within the individual. And this is something that we will address at length in the next part 2 of this essay series when we talk about Ken Wilber. I personally think that it has to be a singular God image, as in the form of a reified being, for this concept, this as if it were of God, to truly function in the best possible sense. This is because it seems to me that when a society loses its God image, the centralizing figure of what is deemed wise and loving and good, things fall apart rather quickly. The same thing could be asserted about individuals in their own personal lives, though this claim is a bit tricky, since there are clearly individuals who live meaningful lives without belief in a God. Or, maybe put in another way, these people do not have an explicit notion, a symbolic notion of God to take the role of God. They almost always have something else, whether that's justice or universal love or whatever it may be. But to have sort of these values as their chief and ultimate concern, it is different than having faith in a God and a God image. So I do want to, at the very least, acknowledge that and not make any atheists feel like, oh, this guy believes in God, and so he's just like all the other ones who think if you don't believe in God, you're not going to be a moral person. That's not, I really don't believe that. I think that you can be a great and moral person without explicit belief in a God image. Now, that aside, I do think that society must treat the notion of God as if it were true, regardless of what may be called the literal truth of the God image itself. I think that this is really where religion steps in to give coherence, I guess, to the masses, you could say. But really what it is it's bridging the gaps upward and downward on the hierarchy of perception, which again we'll get into more when we talk about Ken Wilber in the next essay. But that to me is really where religion and the God image have their time to shine, is bridging outside of the individual relationship from the person to the world and broadening the scope from persons to persons, cultures to cultures. These archetypal images, the God image, the unifying God image, these things matter a lot at that level of thinking. And Jungian archetypes function in this same way. As well does idealism, sort of Platonic idealism, as a philosophical school. That comes to mind as well in this discussion. So both of these schools of thought refer to things that are anyway more real than what is real, the sort of capital F forms that undergird existence itself. Now, another aside, I'm not really a Platonist. I'm not a huge fan of Plato's forms, especially not as they're described. I actually did a video about why you don't understand Plato's forms, and I'll put a link to that. I'll link it here in the video. But I do think that there is something to this concept of idealism. Not that all the things that are really real exist outside of reality. I don't believe in this weird sort of Neoplatonic Christian Maya, like the Buddhist Maya, that everything, the physical world, is actually just an illusion. That's not what I believe at all. I'm much more Nietzschean in the sense that I do not think that there is necessarily this other world where the gods and the morals of this world reside. And if we can just tap into that other world, then all of our questions will be answered. I think the world that we have is right here. I think there's gradations of perception within this world, and I'm always willing to be proven wrong in terms of, is there a literal heaven outside of this universe? But even then, that's not what we believe as a church, as Mormons. For the Mormon doctrine, the spirit world is here on the earth. We just can't engage with it. Now, is that as if it were an other world, the sort of Platonic world outside of this world where all the forms and the spirits dwell? I suppose so. I have an intuitive qualm with that, but I think that the world is here, and what we have in existence ultimately is only what we can observe and sense within our bodies, and that does not preclude that is all that is. There's clearly other things going on, even just from the fact that our scientific instruments, our observational instruments, allow us to see things that do interact with us and our other objects in the physical world, like particles and things that we could never have seen otherwise, and we probably wouldn't even have noticed otherwise, especially if you get into basic fundamental physical particles that you get out of the Hadron Colliders and stuff, and the observations that we get about stars and things from telescopes and gas chromatography readings and the colors that they emit and what that says about the stars when we get the same colors. There's all these things that we never really would have been able to observe as human beings without these instruments, and that doesn't mean that they don't play a major role in the unfolding of the universe, because clearly they do. So I think that it's something like that with the spiritual as well, that we're grasping into the realm of the right hemisphere mode of perception. So that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And if you treat it as if it does not exist, this sort of way of interacting with the world, as if it were the treating of God as if he were real, a free will, all these things, if you leave those things to the side because they can't be explicitly proven in a left hemisphere way, you run the risk of excavating out all that makes life worth living, and you also worth excavating out all of the potential for knowledge and wisdom, the proverbial gas chromatography of the soul that we simply haven't gotten there yet as individuals and societies. And we need to keep digging into this realm, the as if it were realm, if we're ever going to get there. So back to the article that I wrote. A recent example of the as if it were is something that I gleaned from Stephen Fleming's PhD thesis. That thesis is titled Christian Platonism and the Origins of Mormonism. It's fascinating. I highly encourage all of you to read it. I'll put a link to the PDF in the description of this video. So this thesis is a strong intellectual case that Joseph Smith's revelations are not original in this sort of ex nihilo sense of the phrase original revelations, which came to him seemingly out of nowhere, thus the phrase ex nihilo. Instead, Joseph Smith's teachings and the LDS Church are much more a modern reinstitution of very ancient rites from paganism, Neoplatonism, early Christians, the doctrines and rites and rituals which have been lost from mainstream Christianity for a very long time. This is actually part of the LDS Creed itself. We believe in the same organization that existed in the primitive church, and yet it can feel uncomfortable or even blasphemous as an active Latter-day Saint to say that Joseph Smith's revelations did not fall down from a spiritual world beyond and simply then appear in his mind. It appears instead as if this notion degrades what it would mean for Joseph Smith or anyone else to be a true prophet. What does it mean to be a quote-unquote true prophet? Does it have to be simply like breathing in the peace pipe smoke and channeling the spiritual insights from the beyond? Or is it something else? Is it, like Mormons already believe about the creation of the universe, is it God manipulating the matter already there in a person's mind and soul in order to create a coherent message that unveils just a little bit more of ultimate truth to help humanity progress? So long as Joseph Smith is treated as if he were a prophet, he still functions as a prophet, and his writings are still prophetic. And that also ties into this sort of empirical element of the as if it were, empirical in the sense of putting it into practice, putting the teachings of Joseph Smith, reading the Book of Mormon, following these commandments and covenants and things, being willing to do those things in a spirit of goodwill. And as those things are done, all of a sudden they become as if they were from the mouth of a prophet. So even though Joseph Smith's teaching clearly did not all come to his mind directly as sort of utterances from the divine void, this ex nihilo style of revelation that we like to conceptualize, his teachings are still divine in the sense that they are properly judged from what he understood in the light of divine ideals, the raw material in his mind, and the ever-expanding amount of raw material in his mind as he continued in dialogue with the divine, as he continued to educate himself, always educating himself. This allowed the revelations to come to him, through him, not in the sort of bing, here's things I've never thought of before in my entire life, completely unrelated from all the rest of my thought processes. Instead, it's novel insights and reconstructions of things that he had already learned and believed to be true. And I think that is true for all of us and how we learn. I think it's just an epistemic sort of reality that you don't know something until you know it. So anyways, back to the essay. Is the resurgence of specific ideas passed down with a traceable intellectual lineage somehow less divine than listening to the voice of a literal angel and writing it down? Is the truth not still truth regardless of those circumstances? And think also of the rebuke given to Oliver Cowdery when he tried to translate a passage from the Golden Plates. And this is from Doctrine and Covenants, section 8, verses 6 through 8. Do not murmur, my son, for it is wisdom in me that I have dealt with you after this manner. Behold, you have not understood. You have supposed that I would give it unto you, when you took no thought save it was to ask me. But behold, I say unto you, that you must study it out in your mind. Then you must ask me if it be right. And if it is right, I will cause that your bosom shall burn within you. Therefore, you shall feel that it is right. How could it be any other way, then, than Joseph already having notions of what would belong in the Book of Mormon and then applying divine judgment to the ideas, winnowing down truths and revealing them from the extant mass of intelligence available to him? This does not mean that Joseph Smith was not a prophet. In fact, it also doesn't mean that Joseph did not commune with angels in a literal sense. He may have, he may not have. The as if it were of Joseph Smith's prophethood is simply a recontextualization of what it means to be prophetic, that it does not have to be the dogmatically literal interpretations of everything that are part and parcel of many Latter-day Saints, to be sure, but also many simply religious people, broadly speaking. Or, perhaps more precisely, viewing Joseph Smith as discerner of truth rather than direct mouthpiece to angels is the application of epistemic humility, that when it comes to the supernatural, it may be or it may not be. But Joseph himself must be treated as if he were a prophet nonetheless. When the prophetic mantle is hyper-intellectualized, it becomes too porous and weak to perform its necessary function, which is concealment. Revelation assumes a veil to pull back, and it is thus of the utmost importance to put the veil back when one sees beyond its literal existence, into the forms, into the archetypes, which it must keep hidden. Ludwig Wittgenstein said, "Whereof what one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent." The Greeks also had a phrase that is similar, which is "kalion esti sigan," or "it is better or more beautiful to be silent." The as if it were conveys a similar notion in the sense that when something is treated as if it were true, it is taken out of the realm of rational scrutiny. Not entirely, of course, but there are necessary limits to the usefulness of critique and explicit language. Some things must be taken as if they were real, even if they do not appear to be literally real, because if we question their existence at every turn, they stop behaving right, and we stop behaving right. However, if we are willing to engage in an as if it were relationship with the thing in question, it truly becomes as if it were real. And in this way it forms the Ouroboros and completes the cycle of death and rebirth within us. As if it were images are ultimately necessary as we progress in the hierarchy of consciousness development, something that I will explain in more detail in the next article. And I hope that you all stick around with me for that next article, because that's when things really start to get good. I think Ken Wilber is absolutely fascinating, and the developmental psychologists that he pulls from, Abraham Maslow, Jean Piaget, Jean Gebser is one of the major ones. These are all legitimate psychologists. This is not crackpot theory stuff. And you can take or leave whatever you will in terms of the spiritual aspects and the new wave aspects of what Ken Wilber has done. But as a thinker, as a synthetic thinker, I think he is simply par excellence. You can't think of anybody in our generation who is better than Ken Wilber. And if you want to hear more about that, then stick around and we'll get into that next week. So thanks for joining me. My name is Jake. This has been the Polysophical Society. And until next time.